March 15, 1931, 11:47 p.m., Al Capone stepped into the abandoned warehouse on Chicago's South Side, knowing he was walking into his own execution. 20 of the deadliest assassins in America were positioned throughout the building, each armed with Thompson submachine guns and explicit orders to ensure that Al Capone would never leave alive. The contract on his head was worth $500,000, more money than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. But as Capone calmly lit his Cuban cigar and adjusted his fedora in the dim light, he smiled with the confidence of a man who had turned what should have been his death sentence into the greatest trap in criminal history. In the next 8 minutes, 19 of those hitmen would be dead, and Al Capone would cement his reputation as the most dangerous man in America. What nobody knew that night, what even the men hunting him didn't understand, was that Al Capone had orchestrated his own assassination attempt. Every gunman in that warehouse thought they were there to collect the biggest bounty in organized crime history. In reality, they were walking into a killing field designed by the one man in Chicago who understood that sometimes the best way to eliminate your enemies is to let them come to you. To understand what happened in that warehouse, you need to understand the situation Al Capone faced in March 1931. After years of ruling Chicago's underworld, cracks were beginning to show in his empire. The federal government was building tax evasion cases. Rival crime families were forming alliances against him. Most dangerously, a group of independent contractors had been hired by his enemies to end his life permanently. These weren't street thugs or desperate criminals. These were professional killers, men who had eliminated targets across the country and never failed to complete a contract. They had been studying Al Capone's movements for weeks, learning his habits, mapping his security, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. But there was something these professional assassins didn't know about Al Capone, something that would cost 19 of them their lives. Al Capone had spent his entire career staying 3 steps ahead of his enemies, and he had been watching the hunters while they thought they were hunting him. February 20th, 1931, 3 weeks before the warehouse confrontation. Al Capone sat in his office at the Lexington Hotel, reading intelligence reports that would have terrified any other crime boss in America. 23 professional assassins had been hired to kill him. They were being paid $500,000 total, with an additional $100,000 bonus for whoever actually pulled the trigger. "Boss, we need to go underground," Frank Nitti, his chief enforcer, said nervously. "These aren't local thugs. These are killers from New York, Detroit, Kansas City. They've never failed a contract." Al Capone looked up from the reports and smiled. "Frank, you're thinking about this all wrong. We don't run from 20 killers, we invite them to come find us." "What do you mean?" Nitti asked, confused by his boss's calm demeanor. "I mean, we're going to give them exactly what they want, a chance to kill Al Capone, and when they take that chance, we're going to kill every single one of them." What Nitti didn't understand was that Al Capone had developed the most sophisticated counter-assassination strategy in criminal history. He wasn't planning to hide from his enemies. He was planning to use their own bloodlust against them. February 25th, 1931, 18 days before the confrontation, Al Capone made a phone call that would set his trap in motion. The number belonged to Vincent the Knife Romano, a corrupt Chicago police detective who sold information to the highest bidder. "Vinny, it's Al. I need you to do something for me, and I'll pay you $10,000 for 5 minutes of work." "What kind of work?" Romano asked, immediately interested. "I need you to leak information about my schedule. Specifically, I need you to tell certain people that I'll be alone at the old Meridian warehouse on March 15th at midnight. No bodyguards, no security, just me meeting with a federal informant who's going to help me beat the tax charges." Romano was confused but not stupid enough to ask questions when $10,000 was involved. "You want me to tell people where you'll be alone and vulnerable? That's exactly what I want you to do. And Vinny, make sure the information gets to people who really want me dead." What Romano didn't know was that he was participating in the most elaborate assassination trap ever constructed. Al Capone wasn't just leaking his location, he was creating an irresistible opportunity for every killer hunting him to strike at once. Over the next 2 weeks, the information about Capone's vulnerable appearance at the Meridian warehouse spread through the criminal underworld like wildfire. Independent contractors, rival crime families, and freelance assassins all learned that Al Capone would be alone and unprotected on March 15th. By March 10th, 23 professional killers had confirmed their attendance at what they thought would be Al Capone's execution. They came from across the country, drawn by the combination of the massive bounty and the rare opportunity to eliminate America's most notorious criminal. But while the assassins planned their attack, Al Capone was preparing something entirely different. March 12, 1931, 3 days before the confrontation. Al Capone held a meeting in the basement of the Four Deuces Club with only his most trusted lieutenants. The men gathered around the table represented the core of his organization: Frank Nitti, Jack McGurn, and Tony the Ant Spilotro. "Gentlemen," Capone said, spreading blueprints of the Meridian warehouse across the table, "in 3 days we're going to eliminate more enemies in one night than most crime bosses kill in their entire careers." McGurn studied the blueprints carefully. "Boss, how do we know they'll all show up?" "Because," Capone replied, pointing to various positions on the warehouse floor plan, "I'm going to give them exactly what they want. Me, alone in a building with multiple entrance points and perfect sightlines for snipers. It's going to look like the easiest kill of their careers." "But you won't actually be alone," Nitti said, beginning to understand the plan. "No, Frank. I'll be protected by the best security system money can buy. 20 of my most loyal soldiers will be positioned throughout the building before the assassins arrive. But here's the beautiful part. The killers will never see my men until it's too late." Capone's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. The Meridian warehouse had been abandoned for 2 years, but over the past week, his crew had been secretly modifying the building. Hidden compartments had been built into the walls, concealed platforms had been constructed in the rafters, secret passages had been carved between rooms. By March 15th, the warehouse would look empty to anyone conducting surveillance, but it would actually contain 20 of Capone's deadliest enforcers, each armed with automatic weapons and positioned for a perfect ambush. "The assassins will surround the building thinking they're trapping me," Capone explained to his men, "but they'll actually be trapping themselves. When they move in for the kill, they'll be caught in a crossfire with no escape routes." March 14, 1931, the night before the confrontation. While 23 assassins made their final preparations to kill Al Capone, Capone's soldiers were taking their positions throughout the Meridian warehouse. Each man had been given specific coordinates, detailed instructions, and enough ammunition to fight a small war. "Remember," Capone told his assembled fighters, "we wait until all the killers are inside the building. I want every single one of them trapped before we begin shooting. This isn't just about survival, this is about sending a message to every criminal in America that hunting Al Capone is a death sentence." The plan required perfect timing and absolute discipline. Capone's men would have to remain hidden while professional killers searched the building, waiting for the exact moment when retreat would be impossible. But Al Capone had chosen his soldiers carefully. These weren't desperate street criminals or unreliable thugs. These were professional gunmen who had been with his organization for years, men who trusted their boss's strategic mind and feared his reputation more than they feared death itself. March 15, 1931, 11:47 p.m., Al Capone walked through the front entrance of the Meridian warehouse exactly as he had promised. He wore his signature pinstripe suit and fedora, carried no visible weapons, and appeared to be completely alone. To the 20 assassins watching from various positions around the building, he looked like the perfect target. What the killers didn't know was that 20 of Capone's soldiers were already inside the warehouse, positioned behind false walls, in ceiling compartments, and within hidden alcoves that had been constructed specifically for this ambush. As Capone walked to the center of the warehouse floor and lit his cigar, the assassins began moving into position. They communicated through hand signals and prearranged codes, coordinating their attack with the precision of a military operation. "Target is in position," whispered Eddie. The Blade Morrison into his radio. Morrison was one of the most successful contract killers on the East Coast, a man who had eliminated 47 targets without ever leaving evidence or witnesses. "All units moved to secondary positions," came the response from Vincent "Deadeye" Torino, the sniper positioned in the building across the street. "We take him in 60 seconds. But as the assassins closed in on their target, Al Capone stood calmly in the center of the warehouse, checking his gold pocket watch and smoking his cigar, as if he was waiting for a business meeting rather than facing execution. "Something's wrong," muttered Frank, the ghost Luciano, a killer from Detroit who specialized in close-range eliminations. "This is too easy. Capone's not this stupid." "Shut up and take the shot," Morrison hissed. $500,000 is waiting for whoever puts him down." That's when Al Capone did something that froze the blood of every assassin in the building. He looked up at the rafters where Tommy Silent Brooks was positioned with a sniper rifle, smiled and waved. "Good evening, Tommy." Capone called out in a voice that echoed through the warehouse. "I was wondering when you'd show up. How's your wife doing? Still living in that nice house in Boston?" The revelation that Capone not only knew Brooks was there, but also knew personal details about his family sent shockwaves through the assembled killers. If he knew about Brooks, what else did he know? "He's made us," Morrison said into his radio. "All units, take him now." But as the assassins raised their weapons to fire, Al Capone simply smiled and said 5 words that turned their carefully planned execution into their own death sentence. "Gentlemen, welcome to my parlor." That's when the walls of the warehouse exploded with gunfire. 20 Thompson submachine guns opened fire simultaneously from concealed positions throughout the building. The assassins, caught in the open while moving to attack positions, found themselves trapped in a killing field with no cover and no escape routes. Eddie Morrison managed to fire 3 shots before bullets from 4 different directions tore through his chest. Vincent Torino's sniper position was eliminated by a hidden gunman who had been positioned in the building next door specifically to counter sniper attacks. Frank Luciano tried to reach the exit but was cut down by crossfire from soldiers hidden behind false walls. The battle lasted less than 3 minutes. 23 professional assassins had walked into the warehouse hunting Al Capone. When the shooting stopped, 19 of them were dead and 4 were dying from wounds that would kill them before sunrise. Al Capone had not fired a single shot. He had simply stood in the center of the warehouse, smoking his cigar and watching as the most sophisticated assassination attempt in American criminal history turned into a massacre of his enemies. When the gunfire ended, Capone walked calmly among the bodies of the men who had come to kill him. He stopped next to Eddie Morrison, who was still alive but bleeding to death from multiple gunshot wounds. "Eddie," Capone said, kneeling down next to the dying assassin, "you were hired to kill me for $500,000. That's a lot of money. But you made one fatal mistake." "What mistake?" Morrison gasped, blood filling his lungs. "You thought hunting Al Capone was a job." "It's not a job, Eddie. It's suicide." Morrison died 30 seconds later, becoming the 19th assassin to be eliminated in what would become known as the Meridian Warehouse Massacre. But the massacre was only the beginning of Al Capone's message to the criminal underworld. What he did in the hours after the shooting would ensure that no professional killer would ever accept another contract on his life. March 16, 1931, 3 a.m. While Chicago police investigated reports of gunfire at the Meridian warehouse, Al Capone was already implementing the second phase of his plan. The 4 surviving assassins hadn't died yet, but they were severely wounded and unable to escape. Capone had his men load the survivors into cars and transport them to different locations throughout Chicago. But these weren't random dumping grounds. Each survivor was taken to a location that had personal significance to their criminal careers. Eddie Morrison's body was left outside the Detroit hotel where he had killed his first target 10 years earlier. Vincent Torino was found on the steps of the New York courthouse where he had assassinated a federal witness. Frank Luciano was discovered in the Kansas City warehouse where he had eliminated 3 members of a rival crime family. But each body came with a message that would terrify every criminal organization in America. Pinned to each corpse was a note that read, "This man tried to kill Al Capone. This is what happens to people who hunt the hunter." Within hours, news of the Meridian Warehouse Massacre had spread throughout the criminal underworld. 23 professional assassins, men who had never failed to complete a contract, had been eliminated in a single night by a trap so sophisticated that none of them had seen it coming. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Crime bosses across America began reconsidering their plans to eliminate Al Capone. Independent contractors stopped accepting bounties on his head. Even the federal government began to understand that they were dealing with a criminal mind far more sophisticated than anything they had encountered before. March 20, 1931, 5 days after the massacre, Al Capone held a press conference at the Lexington Hotel, surrounded by reporters who wanted to know about the bodies that had been discovered throughout Chicago. "I don't know what you're talking about," Capone told the assembled journalists with a straight face. "I was having dinner at the Palmer House Hotel on March 15th. I have witnesses who can confirm my whereabouts." Of course, Capone's alibi was perfect. While the massacre was taking place, 3 Chicago aldermen and a federal judge were having dinner with him in the Palmer House restaurant, completely unaware that their dinner companion was orchestrating the elimination of 23 assassins across town. Mr. Capone, one reporter asked, what do you say to allegations that you're responsible for the deaths of these men? Capone smiled and lit a fresh cigar. I say that professional killers live dangerous lives. Sometimes that danger catches up with them. It's unfortunate, but it's not my problem. But privately, Capone was sending a very different message to criminal organizations across America. Word spread quickly through the underworld that Al Capone hadn't just survived an assassination attempt, he had turned it into the most successful counterattack in criminal history. The man's not human, one Chicago crime boss told his lieutenants. You don't just survive 23 professional killers, you don't turn an execution into a massacre, unless you're operating on a level that the rest of us can't even understand. Within weeks, Al Capone began receiving tribute payments from crime organizations that had previously considered him an enemy. Gang leaders who had contributed money to the assassination bounty were now offering to pay protection money just to ensure that they would never find themselves in Capone's crosshairs. The Meridian Warehouse massacre had accomplished something that years of traditional warfare couldn't. It had established Al Capone as not just the most powerful criminal in Chicago, but as a man so dangerous that even professional killers feared to challenge him. April 1, 1931, 2 weeks after the massacre, Al Capone sat in his office at the Lexington Hotel, reading reports about the impact of the warehouse incident on organized crime across America. Assassination contracts on his head had been canceled. Rival crime families were requesting peace negotiations. Even federal investigators were approaching his case with a new level of caution. Boss, Frank Nitti said, entering the office with a stack of telegrams, we've got messages from crime families in New York, Detroit, Kansas City, and Los Angeles. They're all asking for meetings to discuss territorial agreements and tribute payments. Capone smiled and leaned back in his leather chair. Frank, do you know what the difference is between a gangster and a general? What's that, boss? A gangster reacts to threats. A general turns threats into opportunities. Those 23 killers came to Chicago thinking they were going to collect a bounty. Instead, they gave us the greatest victory in the history of organized crime. The Meridian Warehouse massacre would be studied by criminal organizations for decades as an example of how superior strategy could overcome superior numbers. Al Capone had faced impossible odds and turned them into a complete victory through careful planning, perfect execution, and the kind of psychological warfare that his enemies never saw coming. Years later, when federal investigators finally pieced together the full scope of what had happened that night, they would realize that they had been dealing with one of the most sophisticated criminal minds in American history. The man who had once been dismissed as a brutal thug had proven himself to be a strategic genius capable of orchestrating complex operations that military commanders would have envied. The warehouse massacre wasn't just about survival, it was about establishing dominance through intelligence rather than violence, about proving that Al Capone's greatest weapon wasn't his gun, but his ability to think 3 steps ahead of his enemies. If this story of strategic brilliance and calculated violence amazed you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that in the criminal underworld, the most dangerous enemies aren't the most violent ones, but the ones who can turn your own plans against you. Drop a comment below. Do you think Al Capone's trap was brilliant strategy or just brutal overkill? Turn those notifications on, because next week we're telling the story of how Al Capone's revenge for his brother's murder turned Chicago's streets into a war zone that made the federal government declare martial law. Remember, in the world of organized crime, it's not about surviving the hunt. It's about making the hunters wish they'd never started hunting. And Al Capone proved that night that the deadliest trap is the one your enemies walk into voluntarily.